Chapter 6. The Sound of Silence. How a suppressor works. The tactical employment of sound suppressors, also known as silencers or simply cans, is really an extension of the chapter on snipercraft. However, the subject is so important and sufficiently technical, it deserves its own dedicated space. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for the urban sniper, and even more so for the guerrilla sniper, to hide their muzzle flash, muzzle blast, and gunshot in combat. And there is nothing more effective at hiding all three of these potentially devastating signatures than the sound suppressor. Suppressors were originally called silencers, but since they do not silence a weapon, they only quiet the weapon, the term suppressor is more accurate. A suppressor is simple and has not changed much since American designer genius Hiram Maxim started producing and selling the first commercially successful suppressors in the early 1900s. A suppressor is simply a muffler designed to trap the exploding gases after a gun is fired. When a cartridge is fired in a gun, a firing pin hits the primer explodes, setting off the more powerful gunpowder, which in turn explodes. Since expanding gases take the path of least resistance, the exploding gunpowder rushes toward the opening of the barrel, the muzzle, as it pushes the bullet ahead of it. Once the rapidly expanding gases push the bullet out of the gun and exit the restricted confines of the barrel, they explode with great force and noise into the relatively unrestricted air. What a muzzle-mounted suppressor does is trap this rapidly expanding gas into a series of baffles, which creates turbulence and redirects the gas back against itself, thus slowing, cooling, and dissipating the gas. An integral suppressor is different in that it has a series of ports that gradually bleed off the expanding gas as it moves out towards the muzzle. So, by the time the bullet actually exits the barrel, so much gas has already been bled off, there is no final explosion to contain. Fundamentally, both types of suppressors slow the expanding gases to muffle the explosion. Manufacturers constantly try to create new suppressors with more efficient designs. In general terms, the larger suppressor, the quieter it is. However, since weight and concealability are always a concern, manufacturers must balance noise reduction ability with the size of the can. Currently, a shooter should expect a detachable can to weigh around a pound and give anywhere from 30 to 40 decibels of noise reduction. The caliber of the weapon being fired and the size of the cartridge are important when it comes to noise reduction because the bigger the cartridge, the louder the noise. Many .22 long rifles are inherently quiet because a .22 long rifle cartridge is such a small round with a relatively small powder charge and therefore has a correspondingly reduced gunshot when the expanding gas exits the muzzle. Thus, small-bore rifles like the .22 are easier to suppress than large-bore weapons like a .50 caliber rifle, which has a huge round and a large powder charge. Wet and dry suppressors. All suppressors are dry suppressors, meaning they are fired as is with no liquid additions to the interior of the device. While dry cans are the norm, many suppressors are also capable of firing wet. To make a can wet, all one has to do is pour a small amount of water into the suppressor, turn the can slowly to distribute the water inside the device, and then pour the excess water out. The water in the suppressor will help cool the expanding gases, thus making the gunshot quieter. This dampening effect from the water only lasts for about half a dozen rounds until the heat from the expanding gases causes the water to evaporate. Then the can is dry and slightly louder again. Although water is the most common additive, other liquidatives like urine, engine coolant, and IV fluid like Ringer's lactate and normal saline will also work. Even though there are many different liquids that can be put in a can if the situation demands it, the shooter should be careful not to put anything corrosive or flammable inside. If the shooter does not want to improvise, they can purchase a suppressor coolant designed specifically for wet cans. Capital City Firearms markets a suppressor coolant that is superior to water and similar liquids in that it is heat and pressure resistant, absorbs heat better, clings more to the insides of the suppressor so it is not shot out of the can like water, does not burn, and will not smoke when the can gets hot. Some suppressors can be used with special grease, which is longer lasting than water because it will not evaporate. Some gun oils and lubricants can also be used, but they are not usually recommended because when the can gets super hot, the oil can smoke and even catch fire. The supersonic crack. As mentioned in the previous chapter, when a bullet has such a high velocity it breaks the sound barrier, people can hear a crack as a speeding bullet whizzes by. Contrary to popular myth, a detachable sound suppressor does not reduce the velocity of a bullet below the sound barrier. In fact, depending on the suppressor model, a can may actually increase bullet velocity. As we know, there are weapons with integral sound suppressors that bleed off the expanding gases as the bullet travels down the barrel towards the muzzle. Some weapons, like the MP5SD, do bleed enough of the gases off that they reduce bullet velocity to the point the round is no longer supersonic. In this case, the integral suppressor reduces both the muzzle noise and the supersonic crack. Suppressor maintenance. A suppressor is a mechanical device made out of lightweight steel or aircraft-grade aluminums and alloys. As a mechanical device, all suppressors require maintenance and are prone to eventual failure. Over time, the constant superheating and cooling of the metal suppressor combined with the corrosive property of the weapon's gases will erode the suppressor's effectiveness. Suppressor life depends on how well it is maintained and on the inherent quality of the can. Some suppressors may outlast the life of the gun barrel, as Surefire claims their cans have a service life up to 30,000 rounds. Recommended suppressor maintenance depends on the manufacturer. Canadian Tactical says this about reflex suppressors. Remove the suppressor or leave the action of the rifle open after use to avoid corrosion by letting condensation evaporate away. A small amount of light gun oil sprayed into the suppressor will help prevent corrosion. Roll the suppressor around to spread the oil over all the interior surfaces. Normal fouling from powder and primers does not affect the suppressor's functioning. Loose, solid impurities like powder grains and carbon chips are easily removed by shaking the suppressor while keeping it vertical, front and down. Washing with liquids or solvents is unadvisable. Store weapons muzzle down with the action open to promote air circulation and prevent oil and fouling from entering the action. Knights Armament Company says this about their M4QD suppressor. Mount and dismount the suppressor from the weapon several times using a twisting motion to enable the compensator's carbon-cutting grooves to dislodge carbon and metal fouling buildup. Dry brush loosened residue from parts using the general-purpose toothbrush from the weapon cleaning kit. Take care to orient the parts so carbon does not fall down into the weapon bore or down into the suppressor body. Copper remover should be used to remove copper fouling from both the QD compensator and the corresponding internal QD suppressor surfaces which contact the compensator, if obvious. Remounting and dismounting the suppressor, with the muzzle and suppressor held horizontal, once it is wet with copper remover, may also help remove residue. The user should final clean and dry the copper remover affected parts with an absorbent cloth. Do not oil the QD suppressor body. Wipe it dry with a clean cloth. Apply only a light oil coat of CLP to the QD compensator to prevent corrosion each time the weapon is cleaned. A very light coat of CLP should be applied to the suppressor latch plate legs to smooth their operation. A final word on suppressor maintenance is to ensure the suppressor is aligned properly to the weapon. Once aligned properly and securely, the shooter should check the suppressor regularly to make sure it is in the proper position. If the suppressor is not perfectly aligned, an outgoing bullet can strike the suppressor, damaging the can and throwing off the bullet. Furthermore, even if the suppressor remains in proper alignment, the shooter should check the suppressor periodically after shooting. When a bullet leaves the barrel of a weapon, it may yaw, meaning the bullet deviates from its intended rotational axis. I have seen a bullet, which was fired from a perfectly mounted suppressor, yaw upon exiting the barrel and clip the end of the suppressor, tearing off a small piece of the can. The suppressor had to be removed and sent back to the manufacturer for replacement. Resistance to sound suppressors. Even as far back as World War II, some professionals appreciated the capabilities of a sound suppressor. Colonel Mason McFarlane, who was the British military attaché in Berlin in the 1930s and lived within a view of where Hitler observed the big parades in Berlin, wanted to kill Hitler using a suppressed weapon. By the spring of 1939, Mason McFarlane correctly judged that Hitler intended to start a war and warned the British government to either kill Hitler now or start a preemptive war, because with every passing month, the likelihood of either prospect dimmed. Mason McFarlane later related his plan. In London, I had strongly urged that Hitler should be assassinated. My residence in Berlin was barely 100 yards from the saluting base of all the big Führer reviews. All that was necessary was a good shot and a high-velocity rifle with a telescopic sight and silencer. It could have been fired through my open bathroom window from a spot on the landing some 30 feet back from the window. True, Hitler could have been shot with a suppressed weapon, as the loud sounds of marching soldiers, cheering crowds, and ceremonious bands would have provided so much covering noise that the shot would have been undetected. However, the subsequent dragnet conducted by Hitler's SS bodyguards would have found the likely shooting platform, and the Gestapo would have used their persuasive questioning techniques to get some answers. It would have been a suicide mission, but millions of lives would have been saved. The sniping plan was rejected by London, and World War II erupted later that year. Surprisingly, almost 70 years after Mason McFarland's plan, most people in military and policing communities are ignorant to the capabilities and advantages of the sound suppressor. Even in professional sniping circles with men who have experienced combat, many do not appreciate and thus do not use a suppressor. Today, there is no excuse for modern military and police sniper not to use a suppressor. They are readily available by a score of professional manufacturers who turn out quiet, durable, lightweight, inexpensive suppressors for any weapon out there. And if a company does not have an existing model to choose from, they can custom make one. Why is it so many people, despite being in the shooting profession, know virtually nothing about the characteristics, advantages, and disadvantages of using a suppressor? I think the main reason is obvious. Conventional tactics dominate the field of sniping, and the conventional mindset has become a mental prison, confining security professionals to what they know. Even career military sniper Mark Spicer writes in his book about sniping, "The suppressed sniper rifle is a strange weapon and requires a lot of practice to master. Simply put, most of the world expects that when a gun is fired, flames belch out of the end and the barrel along with an ear-splitting explosion. Instead of solving this problem, the sniping world has grown used to the gunshot and has adapted their tactics to deal with it instead of getting rid of the gunshot itself. Because of this conventional mindset, I have heard officers who were leading men in combat scoff at the idea of using suppressors. They discounted suppressors as something special forces might use, as opposed to thinking of suppressors as being an everyday tool that every soldier and sniper needs to succeed and survive in close urban combat. I've spoken to special operations soldiers who were combat veterans who also scoffed at the idea of using suppressors simply because they too were untrained in the tactical employment of suppressors. The civilian community, who has very little knowledge or experience with suppressors, only see suppressors used in James Bond movies and think of suppressors as an assassination tool. The logic follows, why would you need to use a suppressor unless you were going to assassinate someone? As a result, in the United States, suppressors are highly regulated and a person must get a special permit to own one. Because this assassination suppressor link is so strong in people's minds, possession of an unlicensed suppressor, even a homemade one, is a felony offense. If someone is a professional urban sniper and does not fully understand the capabilities and limitations of a sound suppressor, then they are not a well-rounded sniper. If a sniper fully understands the characteristics of a suppressor, both good and bad, has trained regularly with a suppressor, has tested the suppressor in realistic training and combat, and then decides consciously not to use a suppressor due to tactical reasons, then that is another story. In that situation, the sniper is making an informed, as opposed to an uninformed decision. Ambush in Iraq. Let me tell a story about John, an acquaintance of mine who recently served in combat in Iraq. One afternoon in Iraq, John and his team were ambushed as they drove down a road to investigate reports of an insurgent attack on an Iraqi army checkpoint. As the enemy opened fire, John and his men quickly got off the road and fought their way into a nearby row of houses that lined the ambush zone. John, a trained and experienced sniper, was armed with an SPR Mark 12 5.56mm suppressed sniper rifle. John and his spotter Mike moved to an elevated position in one of the buildings so they could have a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. From this perch, John and Mike had an excellent view of the immediate battlefield and could see several insurgent positions. Soon, Apache gunships arrived to support them. As the Apaches circled overhead like giant angry insects, the helicopters took fire from the insurgents. John searched for targets and saw an insurgent aiming an RPG at the Apaches floating slowly overhead. John aimed at the RPG gunner's head and put a single bullet into the side of his skull, blowing brain matter out of the other side. John soon found other targets. An insurgent armed with an AK-47 stepped around a corner and then took a round from John in the chest, knocking him off his feet. Another insurgent stepped around the corner and looked around, trying to find the source of the gunfire. John hit him too, killing him just like the first one. In the space of about 5 minutes, John located, engaged, and killed 13 insurgents in an enclosed urban area where the longest shot taken was about 200 meters, and most of the shots were half that distance or less. The only reason why John made so many kills in such a short space of time at such close distances was because he used a suppressed weapon. He killed one enemy, and then another, because they had no idea where the deadly shots were coming from. They could not hear the shots, and they could not see a muzzle flash. What prevented John from making more kills was that his spotter, Mike, started firing at the enemy too, but his weapon was not suppressed. As soon as the insurgents heard and saw Mike's gunfire, they knew where to hide from. It was no surprise to John that a suppressed weapon helped him fight off a much larger, heavily armed foe. He knew suppressed weapons could give his small team an advantage in an urban environment because he trained with suppressors before deploying to combat. In fact, every man on John's team carried a suppressor on their kit. It was a mandatory piece of equipment, just like their radios and night vision goggles. They knew the advantages of the suppressors, there are many, and they knew the disadvantages, there are few. In short, they were trained and skilled in the tactical employment of suppressors for combat operations. Advantages of using a suppressor. If there are so many advantages to using a suppressor, what are they? First, a suppressor, because it totally encases the muzzle of the weapon, almost completely hides the muzzle flash of the weapon. In fact, from a distance, even at night, it's almost impossible to even know a weapon is being fired. One might be able to see a small flash of light inside the suppressor itself, but this small signature is easily lost among the much brighter, more noticeable lights of a city's background like street lights, car headlights, and normal house lamps. Also, one must understand a weapon emits some flash fire from any space that is not totally enclosed. For example, when firing a semi-automatic weapon, some flash can be seen as the action works, ejects, and chambers another round. Even with a revolver, some flash can be seen where the cylinder meets the barrel. While these flashes are small compared to the enormous flash from the barrel, the shooter still needs to take this signature into account and employ good concealment techniques to compensate for it. As a suppressor conceals a weapon's muzzle flash, it also eliminates muzzle blast and any resulting muzzle disturbance. Anyone who has fired a weapon in a dry climate like the Middle East can attest to how much signature is created by muzzle blast. After firing a high-powered rifle, a small cloud of dust erupts in front of the shooter, giving the position away. In daylight hours, this muzzle disturbance is more incriminating and revealing than the muzzle flash, which, in contrast, can hardly be seen. When a shooter uses a suppressor, their tactical options multiply because they do not have to worry about hiding their muzzle blast. A shooter can lie on the ground or put the muzzle near a dirty, dusty window frame and fire a shot without fear of giving away their position. Just as a suppressor nearly eliminates muzzle flash and blast, a can does an excellent job of what it was designed for, reducing the audible noise heard when a shot is fired. Most modern suppressors on the manufacturer will reduce the sound of a weapon until it is no louder than a car door being shut. With this level of noise reduction, a shooter can easily combine their muffled gunshot with urban cover noise like music, a motorcycle revving, and even a honking car horn to conceal the gunshot from the target and the surrounding population. Ultimately, a sound suppressor is the best form of urban camouflage. If a sniper allows their muzzle blast and flash to be seen and their gunshot to be heard, it is the equivalent of the sniper jumping up and down, waving a big red flag and yelling to the entire city, "Hey everyone, look at me, I'm a sniper and I just fired a shot from a hidden position." Of course, it does not make any tactical sense to jump up and down and scream and wave a red flag, and it does not make any sense to fire a rifle without a suppressor. Another advantage of a suppressor is it allows for better weapons control by eliminating what is called muzzle flip or muzzle climb. There's a whole industry designed to increase muzzle control through such attachments like muzzle brakes and muzzle compensators. Why use these devices when one can use a suppressor that works even better? The fact is, a suppressor eliminates muzzle climb and works much better than any muzzle brake or compensator. On top of this, a suppressor reduces weapon recoil, improving the shooter's control of the weapon. All I ask the reader to do is take a simple test. Take your weapon and fire an entire magazine as fast as you can at a 25-meter target and see what kind of control you have. Then, attach a suppressor and take the same test. Tell me which one offers better control. The truth is, a suppressor enables a shooter to rapidly and accurately engage multiple targets because their barrel will stay on target the entire time. While muzzle control is a big concern when firing a semi-automatic weapon, does the shooter really care about muzzle control when firing a bolt action, lever action, revolving action, or break-open weapon? Yes, the experienced shooter does care about muzzle control, even with non-automatic weapons. This is because a sniper wants to stay on their target throughout the engagement process. Even a sniper firing a bolt-action rifle wants to maintain the same sight picture until they are done servicing the target, especially when a sniper fires a large bore like a 7.62mm or 50 caliber weapon. Muzzle control is difficult, and it takes a second for the shooter to compose themselves and get back on target after making a shot. A suppressor, which is also the world's best muzzle brake, speeds up the entire engagement process. Because a suppressor eliminates muzzle flash and muzzle blast, one can use a suppressed weapon in ways and in environments that would otherwise be off limits. For example, if a person is sitting in front passenger seat of a car armed with a suppressed MP5 SD submachine gun, they can shoot in close proximity to the driver or anyone else in the car without fear of injuring them. Specifically, they can aim their weapon across the front of the driver with the suppressor only inches from their face and fire out the driver's side window at their target, all without fear of blowing out the driver's eardrums or blinding him with the muzzle flash or burning his face with the muzzle blast. If one used a suppressed weapon, they can work in confined spaces and in close proximity, within inches, of other people and do so in a completely safe manner. The use of a suppressor also allows one to work in a potentially hazardous environment with reduced risk to injury. For instance, police officers who regularly raid methadone labs use suppressed weapons because if they fire an unsuppressed weapon in an enclosed space like a drug lab, they can cause an explosion due to the volatile gases given off by the methadone-making process. A suppressed weapon enables a shooter to operate in close proximity to explosive or flammable gases with much less chance of igniting them. There are a whole variety of tactical tasks that can be accomplished quietly when using a suppressed weapon. For instance, one can quietly shoot out a streetlight with a suppressed weapon in order to hide in the darkness. One can shoot a barking dog with a suppressed weapon and quietly remove this potentially mission-compromising threat. A sentry or a guard can be discreetly removed with a single quiet shot from a suppressed .22 caliber pistol. A car's tires can be shot out in near silence, or a window can be shattered with a few well-aimed, quiet shots. An electrical junction or phone relay box can also be quietly put out of action with a suppressed weapon prior to conducting an assault. These are just several examples from a whole list of things that can be accomplished with a suppressed weapon. From a command and control aspect, suppressors bring a lot to the table. The single biggest obstacle to effective communication during a gunfight is the inability to hear or to be heard over the roar of gunshots. Regularly in combat, soldiers have been unable to communicate effectively on a radio or even give or receive simple directions from fellow teammates because somebody is on the machine gun pounding away at a target. Another problem presented in combat is the use of earplugs. Whenever someone is on a combat patrol and contact is likely, most people put a hearing plug in one ear and have the other one in their pocket. This way, they can cut their hearing losses because while they're moving, they can still at least hear out of one ear. But if they suddenly have enemy contact and have to fire unsuppressed weapons, they would not destroy the hearing in both of their ears, they would damage only one of them, until they get the other earplug in. The use of suppressors eliminates this potential for temporary and permanent hearing damage. One does not have to worry about juggling earplugs, and one does not have to yell at anybody to be heard. Suppressing a weapon is useful for more than just combat operations. They are also useful in training. It is far easier to train a new shooter using a suppressed weapon because the shooter will not suffer from flinching, bracing, eye closing, and anticipating the shot like they would if the weapon was unsuppressed and had the normal muzzle flash, blast, gunshot, recoil, and muzzle climb. With a suppressor, a new shooter can focus on the fundamentals of marksmanship as opposed to weathering the blast of an unsuppressed weapon. In short, a suppressor makes a weapon more pleasant to shoot, reduces gun shyness, and instills confidence in beginners. Disadvantages of using a suppressor. There are several disadvantages to using a suppressor, one of which can be compensated for in some way and, in my opinion, are far outweighed by the advantages. The biggest problem with using a suppressor is it extends the overall length of the weapon, making it less concealable. But this all depends on the weapon and the type of suppressor used. Some pistols, like the framed Ruger Mark II, have integral suppressors, meaning that the suppressor is not detachable and is actually part of the weapon. Weapons like these are usually shorter in length than a pistol with a suppressor attached to the end of it. Also, modern rifle suppressors are so compact and fit over the first several inches of the muzzle, they may only extend the length of the barrel by an inch or two. In some situations, one may actually want a suppressor to lengthen the weapon. For example, if a person is firing an M4 assault rifle with a shortened 7.5-inch barrel, they will suffer from an enormous muzzle blast and flash, which makes the weapon almost impractical. In this case, the shooter must have a suppressor on the weapon to make it manageable. And an M4 with a 7.5-inch barrel and a suppressor is still far shorter than the regular M4 with a 14-inch barrel. Another option for the shooter is to carry their weapon without the suppressor attached, as it may be easier to conceal them both if carried separately. Then, once the shooter gets to their shooting platform and they have some privacy, they pull out their suppressor and attach it to their weapon to take the shot. This is an easy task depending on the weapon and the suppressor. Some suppressors are screw-on models, so they have to be threaded carefully onto the barrel to ensure alignment. A suppressor like this may take a minute to secure to the weapon. Other suppressors simply slide over the muzzle and snap onto the barrel, taking mere seconds to either attach or detach. Weight is another consideration when using a suppressor. Although modern suppressors are very light, most weigh around a pound, and some suppressors are as light as 7 ounces. The overall weight is not a serious problem. The real problem is this weight is at the end of the barrel, making the weapon barrel heavy and harder to maneuver. One way to solve this problem is to use a weapon with an integral suppressor so there is no imbalance in the weapon from the start. Another option is to choose a suppressor that is short and overlaps the front of the barrel as much as possible, thus moving the suppressor's weight towards the center of the weapon. Weapons imbalance may not be an issue if one plans on taking a slow, deliberate shot and fires from a stable platform like a bipod. Perhaps the most serious consideration when using a suppressor is it affects the barrel harmonics and performance of the weapon. Again, it all depends on the suppressor and the weapon used. If a weapon has an integral suppressor and a free-floating barrel, then the weapon will not suffer from any adverse effects. However, if one places a quick-attach suppressor at the end of a barrel, this will affect the barrel harmonics enough to affect bullet placement. So, if a shooter is zeroed with their weapon without a suppressor and then places a muzzle-hanging suppressor on their weapon, they will get different shot placement. A solution to this is to zero the weapon with the suppressor attached to it. Importantly, a shooter should want to fire their weapon with a suppressor attached because the suppressor positively impacts barrel harmonics, meaning it reduces muzzle whip and increases accuracy. Surefire Inc., which makes several kinds of high-quality sound suppressors, says their suppressors not only act as harmonic dampers, but increase bullet velocity as much as 50 feet per second. Obviously, before using a suppressor on an actual operation, the shooter must train with their weapon and measure how bullet placement is affected by the suppressor to determine how the suppressor affects their overall shooting. Considerations for the Gorilla. Here is the Heckler & Koch's famous MP5SD with its integral suppressor that bleeds off the weapon's gases as the bullet travels down the barrel. A very quiet, accurate weapon. A guerrilla sniper using a suppressor has other considerations above and beyond these tactical issues. Only conventional military and law enforcement snipers have the luxury of focusing strictly on tactical concerns. To start, the guerrilla must be concerned with how they acquire the suppressor. Because suppressors are viewed by most as an exotic accessory, they may be hard to come by on the battlefield, and this scarcity will drive up prices. Consequently, suppressors are generally expensive item compared to more mundane items like ammunition, scopes, and collapsible stocks. This rarity may raise eyebrows from whoever is selling the suppressor. If the seller is a black marketer, there may be no problem, but if the seller is legitimate, it will be hard to explain why you need a sound suppressor, so you do not disturb your neighbors while you target shoot. In almost every country, sound suppressor has to be acquired illegally through the black market, battlefield recovery, theft, or other means. This is because a suppressor which is instantly tied to assassinations cannot be bought casually or anonymously. In the United States, the government requires a person to get a license to possess a suppressor. This means the buyer must show redundant forms of identification, state the reason for wanting to own one, have no criminal record that would disqualify them from ownership, and state the address where the suppressor will be maintained. In other words, you cannot get a suppressor anonymously. In the Russian territories, specifically Chechnya, suppressors are just not allowed for civilian use. This is not surprising considering Russia has strict gun laws preventing widespread ownership of handguns, outlaw night vision scopes, and requires every weapon sold to fire a bullet into a soft target for ballistics comparison in case the weapon is ever suspected of being used in a future crime. One should note that the use of a suppressor in combat is legal according to the laws of land warfare. An irregular combatant, like a guerrilla sniper, can use a suppressor during combat operations and be in full compliance with international law. While international law does not forbid the use of suppressors, it is the individual countries that restrict their sale and impose national law on their use. This puts the guerrilla sniper in such a position that they are not committing a war crime, but may violate a state's internal laws. Since a guerrilla has to violate national law to get a suppressor, they understand they must hide this incriminating evidence from the authorities just like they hide their illegal firearms. For if a person is found with a suppressor but not a gun, what possible reason do they have for possessing this prescribed item? A suppressor cannot be used for anything but to muffle the sound of a gunshot. It has no dual purpose that can be explained away. What is a guerrilla going to say when caught red-handed during a raid or stopped at a checkpoint? Oh, I found this by the side of the road and I thought it would make a really cool paperweight. That will not hold up in a court of law or even a battlefield interrogation. All these legal ramifications are exactly what the guerrilla organization must keep in mind and prepare for upon compromise, because the government fighting the guerrilla will use the full weight of their legal system as a counterinsurgency tool to put pressure on illegal combatants. In the United States, possession of an unregistered suppressor is a felony offense, regardless if it is attached to a weapon or not. In Northern Ireland, if an IRA sniper is captured with a sniper rifle and suppressor, they just doubled their jail time. Possession of a suppressor also brings to bear the issue of intent. If a guerrilla is caught with a folding stock Armalite carbine under their car seat, it is hard to prove what their intent was. Maybe they were going to go target shooting. Maybe they were going to go hunting. Maybe they were going to go turn it into the police. Maybe they were going to sell it to somebody. Maybe they were dropping it off to someone else. Maybe they were going to kill somebody. If we add the suppressor to the equation, it is harder for the guerrilla to explain their intent as something less than lethal. In contrast, government prosecutors will have a much easier time convincing a judge or jury of criminal or terrorist intent, which will add years to the prison time as opposed to a lighter sentence for mere weapons possession. Improved suppressors. Since the government will go to extra lengths to keep commercially manufactured suppressors out of guerrillas' hands, a few words on improvised sound suppressors is warranted. First, it is not difficult to make an effective improvised suppressor that is nearly as effective as a manufactured one. The best improvised sound suppressors are those copied and reverse engineered in a workshop by someone who has experience in metal fabricating. Guerrilla organizations like the FARC in Colombia have the manpower, resources, and technical know-how to make a commercially manufactured suppressor and then recreate their own in FARC-run metal shops. Although World War II resistance movements did not fully appreciate suppressed weapons, some groups, like the Polish Underground, had the ability to fabricate their own suppressors if they wanted to, as did make their own submachine guns, explosive hand grenades, and other weapons. There are several detailed books and videos on the market today that show the interested reader how to make improvised suppressors in their own garage using materials that are easily and legally purchased at the local hardware store. This is not reverse engineering. This is making a suppressor out of commercially available items like a metal pipe and washers that require simple tools like a hacksaw, a file, and a soldering gun. Some weapons are easier to fit with an improvised suppressor than others. The M4 assault rifle in particular uses a suppressor that snaps on. Other weapons, like purpose-built sniper rifles with nothing for a suppressor to snap onto, require the suppressor to be secured to the barrel using a tightening device, like ones that can be found on a bicycle seat. With the help of an inexpensive manual off of Amazon or a how-to video available as cheaply as $2 and some practice, a person can make a homemade suppressor for almost nothing. It may be a little bulkier than a commercially available one, but it will still work. However, it is hard to find anyone who will admit to having fired and tested a homemade suppressor since, in the United States at least, it must be registered with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which costs several $100s. If not, it is a felony offense. The suppressor's use in modern guerrilla warfare. Since we have established that a suppressor is crucial for successful urban sniping, even more so for the guerrilla, then guerrilla movements all over the world must be using them, right? Wrong. Most guerrilla organizations are as ignorant of the benefits of a modern suppressor as conventional snipers. Perhaps even more so. Guerrilla snipers, like their conventional opponents, have spent most of their efforts adapting to their sniper techniques to deal with the gunshot instead of spending the time and resources on getting a suppressor by hook or crook. Some resistance movements, by sheer chance, have stumbled upon the benefits of suppressed weapons, but most have not. The French resistance in World War II used suppressed weapons on occasion, but they never developed a strong sniper movement against the invading Germans. Some Palestinian snipers used suppressed rifles against the Israelis, but these incidences were so rare such an occurrence created quite a commotion on the Israeli side. The Iraqi insurgents eventually used suppressed sniper rifles, but not on a large scale. Although this may change, since an Iraqi insurgent website recently posted a video of a guerrilla cell fabricating homemade suppressors by the hundreds, the resistance movement that used suppressors the most were the Chechens. This was due to operational mimicking because the Russians themselves used suppressed weapons on such a relatively large scale. The Chechens in saw their effectiveness and then stole, captured, or bought suppressors on the black market to copy the Russian tactics. While we can name a few movements that have employed suppressors, we can name far more that never did. What about Carlos Marighella, the Brazilian revolutionary who fought in the 1960s, whose ideas on urban guerrilla warfare are studied today? He mentions the importance of the urban sniper in his much-cited work, Mini Manual of the Urban Guerrilla, but he never makes a tactical leap to suppress sniping. What was the IRA doing, who many consider to have displayed some of the most sophisticated urban guerrilla warfare methodology to date from 1969 until 1998? Where was their suppressed sniping campaign? And what about the siege of Sarajevo from 1992 to 1996, where the most concentrated, prolonged urban sniping in history took place? Again, suppressed sniping was a rarity. Of course, guerrilla movements suffer from the same lack of foresight, leadership, and innovation that their conventional opponents do. Just because a resistance movement grasps the fundamentals of urban sniping does not mean they are experts in their discipline and understand all aspects of their field. However, a lack of understanding of the tools of their trade might make a guerrilla sniper an endangered species. This is because the threat to the unsuppressed shooter is very real, as every human being in their own gunshot detection device, armed with 2 ears and 2 eyes that can accurately and instantly determine the general location of a gunshot. As modern warfare becomes more technically oriented and acoustic counter-sniper devices grow in popularity, the importance of the sound suppressor becomes apparent. Fortunately for the government security forces with the job of fighting a resistance movement, few urban guerrilla snipers have taken their profession to a higher level, with the use of suppressed weapon would certainly indicate.